Quick note, songs of experience, is that the land room text for this retreat?
Yeah,
Cool. Nothing to do tonight then.
think so.
More or less there, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Grazie. Yeah.
No. Right. Right. Good morning, everyone. How are you? All right. And so my name is Katsun or Yaki. Katsun is my name as a monk, my ordination name. I've been here for the last 17 and a half years, and my time here is drawing to an end almost. And this is one of the last things that I'll be doing here for the next couple of years. And so, as it happened today, is a special day in the Tibetan calendar. It is called Lama Tsongkhapa Day, or in Tibetan, the name for this holiday is Galden Namchu. Just a second. Galden Namchu, which translates into English as the great offering, the Galden's great offering of the 25th. And so Tibetan calendar is a lunar calendar. It begins, the first month in the Tibetan year is around February, March, sometimes around April. And so this particular day, Lama Tsongkhapa Day, is celebrated on the 10th Tibetan month, the 25th of the 10th Tibetan month. And it is celebrated all across Tibetan cultures, Tibetan traditions. And so a while ago, when we had a look at the spiritual program here at the center, we figured out that Geshe Tsultrim, the main teacher here at the center, is going to be away during Lama Tsongkhapa Day. And so we thought of what we're going to do for Lama Tsongkhapa Day. We had different activities planned today for the center, at the center, and I volunteered to maybe say a few words about Lama Tsongkhapa. So I don't know how it's going to work out. Let's try it out. And so Lama Tsongkhapa Day, the 25th of the 10th Tibetan month, is a big celebration in Tibetan communities. And interestingly, it's a celebration of light. It's almost always close to Christmas. I think that this is really fascinating. So Christmas is also, in some sense, you can say a celebration of light, particularly when you drive around, I guess, everywhere in Australia, where you see kind of houses decorated with wonderful light offerings. And so Tibetans also celebrate it as a celebration of light, making a lot of light offerings. So when you travel across Tibet, when you travel across India, particularly at this point, this day, in the evening, you have a wonderful celebration of light. And Tibetans, like Indians, they like to bling everything. Everything is super duper blinged with lights and shining things, and a display of flowers and offerings. Also, interestingly, I grew up in Israel, hence my accent. Around this time of the year, there is a Jewish holiday called Hanukkah, also a celebration of light. There's a lot of candles being lit and good food. So I just found it interesting that around the same time of the year, in different cultures, different places around the world, people celebrate a celebration of light. Maybe it has to do with having maybe in the northern hemisphere, days are getting shorter, darker. Maybe it's a good time for a celebration flight. And so it's a celebration of the life of a great Tibetan master called Lama Tsongkhapa. And so when I thought of what I'm going to speak about today, I thought of speaking about the history, the evolution of Buddhism in Tibet, and then to see how pivotal Lama Tsongkhapa was for the evolution of Buddhism in Tibet. And also then to think of how 600 years after the life of Lama Tsongkhapa, we still enjoy the teachings and the activities of Lama Tsongkhapa. And that would lead us to, at the end, I thought of reciting together the Guru Yoga of Lama Tsongkhapa together with one of the Lamrim texts that he composed. And so Buddhism made its way to Tibet around the 7th century. It was Tibet at some point in time was a big empire. It reigned not only across the Tibetan plateau, but also across parts of China and also parts of Mongolia. And around the 7th century was a great Tibetan emperor called Tritson Detsen that married not only a Tibetan, he had a few wives. He had a Tibetan wife, married a Nepalese princess, and also he married a Chinese princess. So both Nepal and China at that point in time were Buddhist places, Buddhist kingdoms. And so through his Chinese wife that was Buddhist, he created the first Buddhist, you can say, temple at the center of Tibet, a temple that now is considered to be the most important temple in Tibet, a temple that is called Jokhang. So for those of you who have traveled to Tibet, traveled to Lhasa, this temple was established around the 7th century by Tsongkhapa, sorry, that was the name, Tsongkhapa. Then about 100 years later, at the time of the king Tritson Detsen, the first dissemination of Buddhism started to take place in Tibet. And so the king Tritson Detsen invited a couple of Indian scholars to travel from India to Tibet. So Tibet already had some Buddhist influence. There were Buddhist influences that came to Tibet from China, from Mongolia, across the Silk Road. And also there were people traveling from India to Tibet. And so King Tritson Detsen invited a great scholar, Kamalashila. He also invited Shantarakshita. And it was the point in time where they had to decide which form of Buddhism will take form in Tibet. There was some Buddhist influence that came into Tibet from China that propounded a certain Buddhist approach. And the people that came from India had a slightly different approach. And so the system that came from China is regarded as a system that is called instantaneous enlightenment or sudden enlightenment, in which due to some meditation practices, you can have glimpses into enlightenment so that you have enlightenment in one moment. This is what at the present we call the Chen tradition or even the Zen tradition. And the people that came from India, the scholars that came from India, propounded a system that was slightly different. So rather than discovering enlightenment in an instant, breaking through our mental conceptions and in an instant becoming enlightened, they promoted a gradual approach. And so a great debate was hosted. It is called the Samya debate around, let's say, 7th, 8th century, in which an Indian scholar and a Chinese scholar were having a debate between them. I think that it was probably not just a single one-off event. Probably they had a few consecutive debates and discussions. And at the end of the discussions, the Indian master has won the debate. And thereby, at least the way that the Tibetans tell the story, thereby the Chinese master was asked to leave. And the system that was devised in Tibet was based on an Indian approach that is called the Nalanda tradition approach. I think that probably if we read through historical narratives, if there are kind of more accurate historical narratives, and I think that Geshe said that there are some narratives now that are being translated from the Chinese language into Tibetan that tell the story maybe with some more details or from different perspectives. I would say that probably it was not only a question of theology or philosophical views, probably there were also influential Tibetan aristocrats that either allied themselves with either Chinese rules or Chinese families or Chinese dynasties, and those that wanted to break away from that. Anyway, the system that took place in Tibet was similar to what existed in an Indian institution that is called the Nalanda tradition. And therefore, nowadays, we consider Tibetan Buddhism to be a continuation of the Indian Nalanda tradition that promoted an approach of gradual attainment of the state of enlightenment. So that took place around the 7th, 8th century. Then after King Chitsum Detseng, there was another king who was called the Chi Rinpoche that continued with the dissemination of Buddhism in Tibet. But after Chi Rinpoche, after he finished his reign, another king came into power that was called King Lang Dharma. Now, Lang Dharma was assassinated at some point in time, but also he had other allegiances. And so during his time, the dissemination of Buddhism in Tibet came to a stop. He was assassinated. Then Tibet stopped being an empire. It broke into local small kingdoms all over the place. And so Buddhism went into a state of decline for 150 or 200 years, more or less, for a couple of centuries, let's say like that. Now, Lang Dharma, by the way, is now considered in Tibetan culture to be the demon king. Since he was responsible for the, in some sense, to a great degree, to the breakdown of the first dissemination of Buddhism in Tibet, is considered to be like a demon. And so in popular Tibetan culture, people say that he was an actual demon. He had horns. And so they say that sometimes in central Tibet, when you see people greeting each other, I think that now it's probably culture is changing, catching up or have caught up with the 21st century. But it was quite common, for example, as a token of respect, when you meet another Tibetan person, to put your tongue out and also to scratch your head. And in Tibetan pop culture, it is said that it is showing that you're not a demon like King Lang Dharma. So if you don't have a blue tongue, if you don't have horns, you're safe to go. So that was a popular kind of Tibetan greeting. And so after Lang Dharma, Buddhism went into decline. Also during Chi Rinpoche, the reign of Chi Rinpoche and Chitsum Detseng, monastics came into Tibet. So the monastic order took place. But then after the Tibetan Empire broke into small kingdoms, ordination was almost lost in Tibet. There were a few pockets of monasticism that were left in different places in Tibet. And then a couple of centuries after that, the second dissemination of Buddhism in Tibet took place. And so it started off mainly in Western Tibet, in an old kingdom called Guge. There's this famous story of an Indian master called Atisha that was requested to travel to Tibet from India around the 10th, 11th century to give Buddhist teachings in Tibet, to help restore Buddhism in Tibet. And the story of Atisha is quite charming, all the trials and tribulations that it had to go through in traveling from India to Tibet. The king that invited Atisha was deposed at some point and lost his head, but still was willing to go ahead with that in order for Buddhism to take root in Tibet again. Anyway, Atisha went to Tibet and helped restoring Buddhism in Tibet. And during the time of Atisha, a new tradition evolved in Tibet that is called the New Kadampa tradition, the Kadampa. And so the Kadampa tradition was a tradition that stayed kind of quite close, quite straight, quite honest with the teachings of the Buddha. One of the things that Atisha did was, on the way from India to Tibet, was to write a manual explaining the steps of the path to enlightenment. And so at the time of Atisha, and even many centuries before Atisha, when the Buddhist tradition was alive and thriving in India, particularly was kept in monastic centers such as the Nalanda monastery, Vrikamalashila. There were many commentaries and teachings that were explaining what the Buddha said, but it was difficult to find one system that integrated all the teachings of the Buddha and what one person, what they need to do in order to start from point A and get to the end, point Z, attaining the state of enlightenment. So you had, it is said that the Buddha taught 84,000 discourses. He taught those discourses over, I think, 45 years. And those discourses were taught in three main phases, which are now called the three turnings of the wheel. And so over the years, the Buddha have amassed a great following, many disciples. He gave different teachings to different disciples that came from different backgrounds, have different dispositions, different inclinations, and so forth. And so and also during the time of the Buddha, those teachings were not systemized, were not written down. After the Buddha passed away, when the first council of Buddhist followers was established, they decided to put down in writing the teachings of the Buddha, and they had to decide which teachings make it to the print and how they're going to be documented.
What century was that?
What century was that? It was after the Buddha passed away. So let's say 5th century before Common Era.
Hey, so
yeah.
The Nalanda Masters.
It was before the Nalanda Masters. It was after the Buddha passed away. So I think that I don't know when the Nalanda monastery was established, but I think that it was established after the Buddha, way after the Buddha passed away.
So you're like talking about the 2nd or 3rd century?
Probably around 5th century before BC, before Common Era. And so there were many commentaries that explained different sections of the teachings of the Buddha. Commentaries about the wisdom section of the teachings of the Buddha. Commentaries about the steps of the path that explain mainly the method side. Commentaries explaining the system of knowledge or Abhidhamma. Some commentaries on Vinaya, monastic codes, and so forth. But still, if you wanted to work out what you need to do in order to become enlightened, you had to study a lot, very extensively. I mean, it's still pretty much the case. You need to be committed to study and practice if you want to attain the state of enlightenment. But the facilities that were available to Buddhist practitioners were facilities that were available to those that were fully dedicated to a monastic life. And so Atisha, on the way around the 10th, 11th century, made his way from India to Tibet, and he composed the first genre of text that is called the Elamrim text that explain the states of the path of enlightenment, in which he took many different sources and arranged them together into a presentation that explains what a practitioner needs to do in order to start at the very beginning, cultivate certain Buddhist practice, develop the mind in an initial stage, then in an intermediate stage, then in a full completed stage, all the way to the attainment of the state of enlightenment. And so Atisha did that. Atisha, an Indian master, did that around the 10th, 11th century. And so then Buddhism became again a prominent tradition in Tibet. And there were teams of translators that that were put together in order to bring Buddhism from India into Tibet. And so those team of translators started around the reign of King Chichen Detsen and Jalpachen, and they worked with strict guidelines. So it wasn't the case that one person could decide what they want to interpret or translate into Tibetan. They had to work in teams. They had to check each other's work. And also they had to get an approval for a completed translation to make it into the official collection of Buddhist texts in Tibet. I mean, obviously now we work differently. Now, if I want to translate a text into English or other language, I can do whatever I want. I can use whatever vocabulary I want. I can decide whatever terms or what approach I'm going to use. There's no one that is breathing down my neck and telling me what to do. It is not the case of the translations in Tibet. They work under strict guidelines of translation committees. And so Atisha came into Tibet, and then the second phase of Buddhism started. Now, there were remnants of Buddhism in Tibet before it went into decline. And so those remnants that still exist in Tibet continued on, and this is what we now call the Nyingma tradition. So in the Tibetan traditions, there are now 4 main traditions. There are also some other minor traditions, but the first one is called the Nyingma, the old traditions. Then, after the time of Atisha, 2 other traditions came into being: the Sakya tradition and the Kagyu traditions. Now, the Nyingma tradition, the old one, the Sakya and the Kagyu traditions are not different in terms of the philosophical views that they promote, although you can say that there are some differences in terms of their approach. Mainly, the differences are in terms of the lineages, teachers, the one that transmit instructions on practice or blessings or what have you. And so the Sakya and Kagyu traditions evolved after Atisha. And so Lama Tsongkhapa, as a Buddhist master, a Tibetan Buddhist master, was born in 1357. He was born in eastern Tibet, in a place or an area that is nowadays called Xining in China. It's part of a province called Qinghai. And when you travel to Xining at the present, you can visit a monastery. It's called Kumbum Monastery, which is said to be the birthplace of Lama Tsongkhapa. So the place itself is very arid. It is very arid and dry. I think that Lama Tsongkhapa was born into a family that consisted of a father from a Mongolian heritage, and his mom was from a Tibetan heritage. When I traveled through eastern Tibet some 25 years ago, it was quite interesting to look at areas that had a combination of Tibetan and Mongolian heritage. So people considered themselves Tibetan, but they were living in some areas in Tibet, they were still living in Mongolian tents. And the script that they were using was a Mongolian script. So in Tibet, but still pretty much Mongolian, or a mixture of Mongolian and Tibetan. Anyway, Lama Tsongkhapa came from a similar background. He became a monk when he was in his early childhood. And at some point during adolescence, he traveled from eastern Tibet to central Tibet to further his education. And so at that point in time, what now is called the Kagyu tradition was the tradition that was ruling Tibet. And Lama Tsongkhapa demonstrated great skills. He was a great scholar. He became a great scholar at a very early stage of his life. He studied the collection of teachings that the Buddha gave, and he also studied many of the commentaries that were composed by Indian masters. And he became famous for his erudition. when he was in his early 20s, he composed one of the big commentaries in the Tibetan, at least in the Tibetan tradition, to the system of a system that is called in Sanskrit the Abhisamalankara. So Abhisamalankara is a text that was composed by a Buddhist master called Maitreya that teaches what a practitioner needs to do in order to attain the state of enlightenment, but mainly from the point of view of the practice side, not from the wisdom side, but mostly from the practice side. Now, the text itself is written in a certain code. It provides a list of terms and a list of stages. If you read the text, if I read the text, I have no idea what it says. I mean, I can read the words, but it's difficult to string them together into an understanding of what I need to do in order to become enlightened. So there were 21 major commentaries composed in the Indian traditions that explained what this text, the Abhisamalankara, says. And in some of those texts, they present views that are conflicting. And so Lama Tsongkhapa, in his early 20s, took those 21 commentaries, compared them, and came down with a system of a critical analysis that decides which views were correct and which views were incorrect. Not only that, he also studied at some point in his life, he studied Sanskrit. He was also able to go through the Sanskrit versions of those texts to look at the sutras of the Buddhas and also the commentaries of the Indian masters and put them together in a way that was cohesive. When you think about it, kind of often when I think about what Lama Tsongkhapa did during his early 20s and early 30s, and what I did when I was in my 20s or 30s, I was a bit of, at least in my 20s, a party animal. It's quite interesting to think of how someone could master such great level of intelligence and knowledge, and also practice when they were in the early 20s or early 30s. And so Lama Tsongkhapa became quite famous for his erudition, and he started to gather some traction around him. He then composed, I think that throughout his life, he composed a massive body of literature. But of the two main systems that he composed, that gave a more of a big picture of the steps of the path of enlightenment, we find, first of all, the text that is called the Lama Chemo, the great exposition of the steps of the path of enlightenment. And so Lama Tsongkhapa took what Atisha did 3 centuries before that, the presentation of the steps of the path of enlightenment, which was a more or less a succinct text, and composed a massive commentary to what Atisha did. He brought together sources from sutras and sources from Tantra, sources from sutra and sources from the commentaries that the Indian masters composed, but also explanations given by previous Tibetan masters, and presented the steps of the path of enlightenment in a comprehensive way, thereby providing basically us an opportunity now to access the Buddhist teachings and making it more practical to our daily Buddhist practice. And so now in the Tibetan tradition, when we speak of Lam Rim or the steps of the path of enlightenment, we often associate that with Lama Tsongkhapa, but the main author, the first author of the Lam Rim tradition was Atisha. Lama Tsongkhapa made very clear what Atisha taught in his Lam for the Path of Enlightenment. And so Lama Tsongkhapa composed, first of all, a very extensive presentation, a very extensive commentary to the steps of the Path of Enlightenment. Then a few years after that, he composed the middling presentation of the steps of the Path of Enlightenment. And then he also composed many other texts that gave an abridged presentation of the steps of the Path of Enlightenment. So quite often in this tradition, in let's say, not only in India, but also in centers such as this, we study texts such as the Foundation of All Good Qualities, Songs of Experience, the 3 Principal Aspects of the Past. These were texts that were composed by Lama Tsongkhapa that presented the steps of the path of enlightenment in an abridged manner. And so Lama Tsongkhapa composed them, but also he composed explanations of great philosophical systems that came from the Indian tradition. So nowadays, for those of you that came here today, you came through the Nalanda Master's Garden. We have this beautiful installation outside of 17 foremost masters that came out of the Nalanda tradition. And so the Nalanda tradition, Nalanda monastery, existed for more than 1,000 years and produced a great number of Buddhist scholars, not only Buddhist scholars, but also scholars that had great knowledge of the Indian traditions, poetry, astrology, and so forth. But of those great masters, 17 masters were highlighted by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and they became now known as the 17 great masters of Nalanda. And so Lama Tsongkhapa studied the writings of those 17 Nalanda masters that worked in different areas. So there was an area of literature, a body of literature that explained the Abhisamalamkara, the practice side of the steps of the path of enlightenment. Then there were scholars that explained the philosophical view. There were scholars that explained the monastic code. There were scholars that explained the body of literature that is called Abhidhamma, knowledge. And so Lama Tsongkhapa took those texts and particularly focused on the wisdom side. And so from the wisdom side, we have the most seminal text of Nagarjuna, the fundamental treatise on the middle way called Wisdom, and a commentary that was composed to that by Chandakirti, the supplement to the middle way. They're called Madhyamika texts, but Lama Tsongkhapa really made it clear what those two Indian masters have explained in their writings. And thereby you can say that he established, or he helped establish, a very clear understanding of the Madhyamika view. Now, Lama Tsongkhapa also, although we consider Lama Tsongkhapa to be someone that is holding the philosophical view of the middle way, the Madhyamika view, he also made very clear what was the view that was held by another philosophy that is called the Chittamatra philosophy. So, Chittamatra philosophy, certain philosophical system that is called in English the mind-only school, had a certain presentation of reality. Now, Lama Tsongkhapa, though he was not a mind-only philosopher, still he studied that philosophy and gave a very extensive explanation of what this philosophy means, and thereby it was considered to be a pioneer or trailblazer in the Tibetan system. And so he explained the section of teachings pertaining to wisdom. So we have a text, a commentary to Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle way. We also have a commentary to Chandakirti's text, the supplement to the middle way. The commentary is called The Illumination of the Thought. Lama Tsongkhapa, when you read through the great and middling presentation of the steps of the path, the last part of the text is dedicated to wisdom. It's very complicated. It's heavy, complicated. It assumes a lot of prior knowledge. These sections also considered to be almost like texts that can be presented by themselves as a presentation of wisdom. And on top of that, he composed another text of wisdom that is called Essence of Eloquence. So he composed a presentation of the steps of the path of enlightenment, 5 texts that pertain to the development of wisdom, and thereby he gave more of a great picture presentation of how to proceed along the steps of the path of enlightenment when you follow the sutra side. But on top of that, the form of Buddhism that became very popular in Tibet is Tantric Buddhism. And so Lama Tsongkhapa also composed a great commentary that explains the steps of the path of enlightenment for Tantric practitioners. Now, the Sutra tradition and the Tantric traditions are not held in Tibet to be 2 separate traditions. The Tantric tradition is part of the Mahayana tradition. And so I think that I read in one description of the activities of Lama Tsongkhapa that when he was during the time of Lama Tsongkhapa, there was a lot of I wouldn't say confusion, but there was a lot of diversity in terms of what people practiced in as Buddhist practitioners in Tibet, and there was sort of a kind of very big gray area of ethical discipline in terms of mixing monastic codes with tantric practices and vice versa. There was kind of a lot of, I think, confusion with respect to how one should behave or practice. And then Lama Tsongkhapa was probably quite an orthodox. I think that particularly when you read through some of Lama Tsongkhapa's texts, you can see how orthodox he was in some, in relation to some areas of teachings. But anyway, he made it very clear what ethical discipline should be practiced by monastics, or what is the type of ethical discipline that you can uphold, that you need to uphold if you practice mantra, and how also you can have both. You can be a monastic and also a tantric practitioner without violating your ethical discipline. And so he gave a great exposition to the steps of the tantric path. The text is called in Tibetan the Ngangrim Chemo. So we have the Lamrim Chemo in Tibetan, that's the sutra explanation of the steps of the path of enlightenment. And then we have the Ngangrim Chemo, a very thick text that explains the steps of the tantric path of enlightenment. So these are also a few of Lama Tsongkhapa's great activities, making kind of this big picture explanation of the steps of the path of enlightenment. On top of that, Lama Tsongkhapa established the first monastery that became then the first Gelugpa monastery. And so nowadays, the biggest Buddhist tradition in Tibetan Buddhism is called the Gelugpa tradition. So this tradition was established by Lama Tsongkhapa, and he established the first monastery that is called Gan Monastery in 1409. And so the first big Gelugpa monastery was Ganden. Then I think it was 1416 that the second biggest Gelugpa monastery, Drepung, was established. And 3 years after that, Seda Monastery was established. And so this organization, this center, and this the chains of monasteries or Dhamma centers that belong to the same organization, the FPMT, host geshes, very learned masters that come mainly from Sera Monastery. And so Ganden, Drepung, and Sera are considered to be the 3 great monastic seats. They produce thousands of scholars, which are called geshes. So geshe is a graduation title from a very extensive study programs that takes 20 or 30 years to complete, where monks and also now nuns study every day from early morning to late night, studying, debating, memorizing, and so forth, the teachings of the Buddha and also the commentaries that were composed by Indian masters. And so the system of monasteries, Sera, Ganden, and Drepung, was established by Lama Tsongkhapa in the early 1400s. And so over time, it became the most prominent Buddhist tradition that consisted of, that had thousands of monks, probably tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of monks over the years. When China came into Tibet in 1949 and following that, the uprising in 1959, it is said that 10% of the Tibetan population was a population of monks and nuns, right? 10% of people that lived in Tibet were monastics. Most of them belong to the Gelug tradition. And so I don't know if we have an exact number of the number of monks and nuns that were enrolled in, particularly in the tradition of Lama Tsongkhapa, but when I think of 600 years, 6 centuries after Lama Tsongkhapa and to the present time, where the form of Buddhism that took root in Tibet was Lama Tsongkhapa's Buddhism, the Gelug Buddhism, that was the biggest tradition. Other traditions have also remained, but that was the biggest one. I guess that there were hundreds of thousands, or maybe more, of monks and nuns that were followers of Lama Tsongkhapa. And so China came into Tibet. Tibet is still under the control of China and the Chinese occupation. But in 1959, after the uprising in Tibet, many Tibetans made their way from Tibet into exile and brought together with them Lama Tsongkhapa's teachings for the first time, made them available outside of Tibet. When I say for the first time, actually, I read through an interesting account of an Italian Catholic monk that went on a missionary mission in the late 1700s from Goa in India to Tibet. So he had that idea of converting Tibetan people into Catholicism. And so the account, actually, it's really interesting. I read just a brief account of his life. He went to Tibet, and then he thought that if he needs to, if he wants to convert Tibetans into Christianity, he needs to study Tibetan. And so he learned Tibetan, and then he noticed the erudition of the Tibetan system that is based on study, reflection, and then a lot of debate. He enrolled in some studies, Buddhist studies, across the main Gelugpa monasteries, Sera, Drepan, and Gamden. And then he, for his mission of converting Tibetans into Catholicism, he was looking for a text that would give him an understanding of what Tibetans think or believe in order to address their philosophical views. And so he read through Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chemo. Not only read through Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chemo, he found the text so enticing that he translated the Lamrim Chemo, Lama Tsongkhapa's text, at the end of the 17th century from Tibetan to Italian. It was he sent the text back to the Vatican, and there was some discussions with respect to trying to convert Tibetans into Catholicism. I think that at the end it was more of a political decision to put it aside, put it on the back burner, and not continue with trying to convert Tibet into Catholicism. But the first translation of the Lamrim Chemo was done around the late 1700s or early 1800s by an Italian missionary man. Anyway, then after that, you can say the next phase of disseminating Lama Tsongkhapa's writing was done after after Tibetans went into exile. And so one of the texts I think that is honest, the Dalai Lama says that when he fled from Tibet to India, one of the only texts that he took along with him was Lama Tsongkhapa's text, a presentation of the states of the path to enlightenment. And so now we enjoy, you can say, the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa here in a place like Australia, on account of, first of all, Chinese occupation, which is, and also the destruction of Buddhism in Tibet, which is pretty sad and unfortunate. But we have now an access to many great scholars, contemporary scholars, the Geshes and teachers that teach not only at Chimredzik Institute, but also across the world, that give us an access to the writings of Lama Tsongkhapa. So again, I find it quite incredible to think of someone that lived 600 years ago in a small place in Tibet. He was born in a small place in Tibet and still has such a great influence over so many people across now all the world in the 21st century, providing us an access to the Buddhist teachings also in a way that makes it quite clear for us, quite simple for us to understand how to put those teachings into practice. Now, Lama Tsongkhapa taught those teachings to a community of Buddhists. So, although here we study often the writings of Lama Tsongkhapa, the steps of the path of enlightenment, there's an entry gate to the teachings of the Buddha. And the general idea is that if you're new to Buddhism and you want to understand what the Buddha said in order to put it into practice, this is where you can go to the writings of Lama Tsongkhapa. You still, when you read through that, you still see that it's only to a community of Buddhists rather than to a community of people like us or to me. And yet still, it does provide, it is a very good system that at least makes it easier to see the big picture. Over the years, I've been here for, as I said at the beginning, for 17 and a half years, I've worked with quite a few of the teachers here. Right from the beginning, all the teachers used to say quite a few times about how incredible Lama Tsongkhapa was. Geshe Tsering, that was here for 18 years, used to say in his teaching, Lama Tsongkhapa, halewa. Halewa means amazing, incredible. Lama Tsongkhapa, halewa. And so in the first early years of being here, I thought myself, well, it's just kind of the boasting about Lama Tsongkhapa because they come from the same tradition, they study in the same monastery. It's like almost like a giveaway. You have to say that. But then, having had the opportunity to study the writings of Lama Tsongkhapa here, you do get a sense, I did get a sense of how incredible Lama Tsongkhapa was, particularly when you read through texts such as the Lama Rinpoche, the Great Exposition of the Steps of the Path. Now, Tibetan language and the way that Tibetan write is pretty, I wouldn't say awkward, but it makes it really difficult to pick up a text and read. When we pick up a text and read in English, we have, first of all, a table of contents. We have headings. A text is divided into sentences and paragraphs, makes it very easy to a certain degree to read. Tibetan texts are not written in this manner. So you have a text that is not divided into paragraphs. There's no table of content. Also, there's no traditional way of dividing a certain section or text into what we know as sentences. Tibetan grammar works in a really difficult way. So you can start a sentence or a paragraph in one page and get to the point maybe 5 pages after that in one section, and you have to kind of find a way to read it, to put things together. Now I say that because then I think that it was maybe around the 11th or 12th century, a Tibetan scholar came up with a system of creating some table of content. But the table of content is still very difficult to work with. And so you have sections, so you begin with one point and you say point A has 4 sections, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then you start explaining point 1 and you divide it into 3 sections. And then the first section is divided again into 5 sections. And each one of those sections is often not given a title. You just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, or A, B, C, D, E, F. And you have to basically keep all the structure in your mind to be able to refer to one point that was made maybe 10 pages ago, 50 pages ago, all written in a very flat way, across texts that are sometimes kind of as thick as a brick. And so Lama Tsongkhapa, in his Lama Rinpoche, not only gave a very extensive presentation of the steps of the path of enlightenment, but also through the system of creating some form of outline and structure, was able to keep in his mind that massive, super ident text. It's pretty incredible. I mean, for us, particularly, since I've been working both with English and Tibetan text, I can really appreciate how you pick up something in English. It seems quite straightforward. You look at the Tibetan and you really have to work out to understand how it works. And so that is available to us in English. And so we have communities of Buddhists, not only across Australia, but also across other places outside of Tibetan tradition that now have access to the activities of Lama Tsongkhapa and the writings of Lama Tsongkhapa. So, as Geshe Tashering used to say, Jelin Poche or Lama Tsongkhapa, incredible. It was hands down amazing. And so, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there's an emphasis on integrating our Buddhist practice into what is called the Guru Yoga practice. And so whatever we study, whatever we practice is given to us, is taught to us by our spiritual teachers. And in this tradition, one of the pivotal spiritual teachers is Lama Tsongkhapa. And so in our practice, we rely upon Lama Tsongkhapa. We seek to receive the blessings and the inspiration of Lama Tsongkhapa so that we'll be able to put his teachings, which are teachings based on the teachings of the Buddha, so that we'll be able to put them together in our mind, to practice them, to develop realizations on that basis, and become like Lama Tsongkhapa himself. Lama Tsongkhapa composed a verse that is called, it's very famous in Tibetan culture, it's called the Miktsema verse. It is a verse dedicated for a Guru Yoga practice. And Lama Tsongkhapa composed this verse honoring his teacher, Jetsun Rendawa. Lama Tsongkhapa had a few teachers, but his foremost teacher was Jetsun Rendawa. So he composed this verse, Miktsema verse, that in which he was praising his teacher, and it says that his teacher embodies the aspect of compassion, the aspect of wisdom, and the aspect of ability. So compassion is associated with Chenrezig. Wisdom is associated with Manjari. And ability is associated with Vajrapani. So Lama Tsongkhapa composed this verse, and he said that Rendawa is the embodiment of these three, of Chenrezig, of Manjushri, and of Vajrapani. But then Jetsun Rendawa, that understood the great qualities, that saw the great qualities of Lama Tsongkhapa, turned this verse on its head and offered it to Lama Tsongkhapa himself. So this verse, the Miktsema verse, is a verse that we commonly use in our practices here as a Guru Yoga verse, which we rely upon Lama Tsongkhapa. And so what I thought of doing now to end this session is to maybe recite together the Guru Yoga practice of Lama Tsongkhapa. Before we do that, I'm wondering if you have any questions.
You didn't mention Padmasambhava.
I didn't mention Padmasambhava. You are right. I didn't mention him. All right. So Padmasambhava. And so when King Chitsun Detsen around the, let's say, 8th century invited masters from India to Tibet, invited Shantarakshita, Kamalshila, and then he also invited Guru Rinpoche, that was a Bengali tantric practitioner. And so these three, Kamalashila, Shantarakshita, and Padmasambhava or Guru Rinpoche are considered to be kind of those three forefathers in some sense of Buddhism in Tibet. And so the Tibetans say that Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, was invited to Tibet to subdue the demons. So Tibet was the tradition that existed in Tibet prior to Buddhism is called the Burn tradition. That was a tradition, it still exists, by the way, in Tibet. Now it has more of, over the centuries, it took on aspects of Buddhism. It is a tradition that propitiated local deities and worshiped different elements of nature and so forth. And so this tradition still exists in Tibet. And they even produced their own scholars, their own geshes, combining both the Bon tradition and the Buddhist tradition. So that's Guru Rinpoche. It was a Bengali. Bengali is Bengal in India, the western part of India. Sorry, when?
West, I did
West of India, Bengal.
Western.
Yeah.
And so, because, you know, as government, they still talk a lot about having some bar.
Yeah, kind of.
Not in the Gulubka.
Yeah, well, Padmasambhava is, or Gorin Rinpoche is regarded as a main figure in Buddhism. So, in Tibetan Buddhism. So all across Tibetan Buddhist tradition, so it was a very important figure in the Nyingma tradition, very important in the Kagyu tradition. To some degree, you can say that Gorin Rinpoche is more important in those traditions than in the Gelugpa tradition, although is also considered to be a principal figure in the Gelugpa tradition.
Yeah.
I've seen some presentations that I'm quite sure, you know, some traditions that think of Lamas as like an emanation of Guru Rinpoche or, you know, Guru Rinpoche.
Yeah, so some traditions regard Lama Tsongkhapa as being an emanation of Guru Rinpoche. Yeah, it's actually quite interesting when you look at Tibetan biographies. So Tibetan biographies are called in Tibetan Namtar. The word Namtar is associated with stories of liberation. And so Tibetan biographies are put together in order to inspire the reader to embody the activities of the master. And so I think that the style is portraying a life of a perfect person. Not only a perfect person, someone that is completely above being a human being. I think that, you know, Tibetans have over the years have found a way to relate to the spiritual masters in a way that is completely mythical. You know, I think that many of those biographies give you the sense that those masters were not humans to begin with, that to begin with, they start off as being Buddhas themselves. So I think that probably seeing Lama Tsongkhapa as being Buddha in the chain himself is part of it. Maybe it was true, but I think that this is very common in Tibetan biographies. I think that more contemporary biographies that present sometimes the life of those masters in a way that maybe is more realistic, that is the right word. I think that in some sense they're more inspiring because, at least to me, because it gives you that idea that someone can start off as being just like us and become like Lama Tsongkhapa.
Did Tsongkhapa have teachers who get teachings on either Dzogchen or Mahamudra, which are generally associated with the Nyingma and the Kagyu lineages, respectively? I was just curious to know whether the Gelugpa tradition has any knowledge or the nature of my teachings. Are they a significant part of it, or is it part of the Mahamudra?
Well, first of all, the Gelugpa tradition did not exist prior to Lama Tsongkhapa, and therefore Lama Tsongkhapa's teachers were primarily Kagyu and Sakya. I think that Jetsun Rendawa was a Sakya scholar, as far as I remember. And so Lama Tsongkhapa, I think, got his knowledge and his teachings from those masters. So I think that, and also he came under the patronage of the fourth Situ Rinpoche, Situ Rinpoche, that is now associated with the Kagyu tradition. He also had some interactions with one of the Karmapas, I can't remember which one of them. So he did receive teachings from those traditions. So I think that he received teachings and probably was also a practitioner of those traditions. There are in the Gelugpa traditions, there are also presentations on the Mahamudra tradition according to the Gelugpa. So I think that there was an exchange or interaction between those traditions. Now I think that there is such an emphasis on a scholastic approach in the Gelug tradition that it almost seems as if the Gelug tradition is about academic study and less practice. But when you read through the life story of Lama Tsongkhapa, you get a sense that actually it was a scholar, but it was also a yogi. Now, the amount of time that is spent in retreat, not only retreat, but also having visions, encountering different enlightened beings in his visions and so forth, give you the sense of being kind of a real yogi practitioner. Then probably over the centuries, when the emphasis became a lot on scholastic approach and academic approach, the practice side was a little bit maybe dampened down, but it's still, I think that still exists in the Gelug tradition in some form. And particularly when you look at the Gelug Mahamudra system.
Does FPMT teach nature of mind teaching as part of their curriculum?
Well, you have we had here at the center, for example, we had a few times where the Mahamudra Gelug tradition was taught. There's a great book, a great teaching style given by His Holiness the Dalai Lama on the Mahamudra version of the Gelugpa tradition. Also, I think Lama Sovereign that has both Nigma and also Gelugpa sources or teachers. He also, I think, gave teachings before on Mahamudra. Did you receive those teachings from Lama Sovereign?
Yeah, and Lama Yeshe.
And Lama Yeshe.
Very strong on Mahamudra, so it's not actually expected to say.
Yeah.
The tradition of Mahamudra do have, but maybe it wasn't as emphasized as much. It's certainly in the Lama Yeshe's biography, you see very strongly influenced by Mahamudra. So it's Mahamudra,
Yeah.
Traditionally, a lot of these teachings are very secret, even particularly in a study you might be to a lot of these teachings are very not open book. I think that's very recently from a monk who's been monk for 15 years or so, how skillful Lama Tsongkhapa was in really emphasizing like the Vinaya and ethics and so on, because if you kind of some of these teachings are more secret, it's very easy to then start to, engage in all kinds of strange activities that might not be very ethical, in this like practice. And so have that skill of, bringing back a little bit of discipline that people might tend to.
Well, there's a sutra Mahamudra and tantric Mahamudra. There's also sutra dzogchen and tantric dzogchen, and so probably the secret version of them are probably, or what you refer to, the secret version of them are probably more of the tantric side of them. And I think that when you read through some explanation of Mahamudra from His Holiness's book, or from teachings I remember here on Mahamudra, there are more instructions on how you meditate in the nature of the mind, but instructions which call now the pointing out instructions, so introducing a student to the nature of the mind. I think that this is more of kind of maybe Nigma and Kagyu approaches to that take it to the next level. So those teachings are found in the Gelug tradition, but maybe, definitely they are not on the central. They don't take the central stage, and I haven't heard of introduction to the nature of the mind done in the Gelug setup. Maybe it exists, but I don't know.
Maybe it's in something different.
Yeah, maybe. So you said that you read that maybe it exists, but it's called in it by a different name. Yeah, I don't know enough about it to say definitively yes or no. So Flynn says, is there a translated text of Lama Tsongkhapa you can recommend to read for someone who is relatively new to Buddhism and wishing to read his distillation directly? Well, there is first of all, the translation of the Lama Rinpoche, the Great Exposition on the Steps of the Path of Enlightenment, that was translated into English. It's a very extensive text. And recently, in the last probably couple of years, a translation of the middling presentation of the Steps of the Path of Enlightenment was put together by Wisdom Publications. So these are good I think, two good places to start. So the great treatise on the states of the path of enlightenment, that's Lama Chemo. And then there is a middling presentation by Wisdom Publication. Now there is another commentary which I used a few times that was composed by someone called Geshe Sopa, that gave a contemporary commentary, a very extensive one, to Lama Tsongkhapa's Lama Chemo. And I find this commentary to be so accessible. So if you're looking for an introduction to someone that is relatively new to Buddhism, you can read through Lama Tsongkhapa's Lama Chemo, but I found that Geshe Sopa, and it's called Geshe Sopa's text, it's called Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. Steps on the Path to Enlightenment provides an excellent explanation of the works of Lama Tsongkhapa.
Thank you.
No worries. Hey, Flynn. All right. All right, so maybe to finish off this session, we can recite together Lama Tsongkhapa's Guru Yoga. You can join us. I'll put it on the screen. You can join us if you wish. Sorry. I'll put it also on the screen. Before I put it on the screen, I wanted to.
Let's see that.
And so we're going to read through Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga, and this is this painting that I'm putting on the screen. I'm going to share it with the people at home also. It is traditional painting, but it's called in Tibetan language Tanka. And so this is the Tanka that depicts the setup of Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga. And so in the center you have Lama Tsongkhapa. Then next to Lama Tsongkhapa, beneath him, you have his two chief disciples, Gyaltsabje and Kedrukje. Now, Gyaltsabje was more of the senior, the older student of Lama Tsongkhapa, and Kedrukje was the one that was most strict. I think that when you read through Gyaltsabje's writings, it also seems to be quite strict, sometimes quite direct in his explanation. So these two, Gyaltsabje and Kedrukje, have composed also bodies of texts, extensive writings themselves. And so, for example, here in the study programs in the center that is part of the FMT study programs, we study commentaries of Gyaltsabje to the Ansapas Continuum, the Uttara Tantra Shastra. We also rely upon the writings of Kedrukje in his explanation of some philosophical views. Anyway, let's read through Lama Tsongkhapa's Guru Yoga. So we begin with going for refuge and generating bodhicitta. And so for those of you who want to take it up as a Buddhist practice, then we start, whatever practice, we start with, first of all, correct the motivation so that our practice will become a Buddhist practice, but also we develop the wish to become complete Buddhas, fully enlightened Buddhas, in order for our practice to become a Mahayana practice. So we can think that I want to become like Lama Tsongkhapa himself, to be able to inspire people that are close to me, people across the world, across the generation, across the centuries, to make the most out of our human potential, the potential of our mind, to remove all faults from our mind and to develop all positive qualities, to be ultimately capable of benefiting many living beings. And to do so, we rely upon the teachings of the Buddha, we rely upon the Dhamma that the Buddha taught, and we rely upon the Sangha, those that communicate the teachings to us. And so with a sense of reliance upon the Buddha, the Dhamma, and Sangha, we think, I take refuge until I'm enlightened, in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits of generosity and so-forth, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit sentient beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits of generosity and so-forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigrated beings. I take refuge until I'm enlightened in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits of generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit transmigrated beings. And we also then develop a greater sense of love and care for others through thinking of the four immeasurable thoughts. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were to abide in equanimity, free from the closeness of attachment and the distance of hatred. May they abide in equanimity. I myself will cause them to abide in equanimity. Please, Guru Deity, bless me to be able to do this. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were to achieve Buddhahood. May they achieve Buddhahood. I myself will cause them to achieve Buddhahood. Please, Guru Deity, bless me to be able to do this. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were free from suffering and the cause of suffering. May they be free from suffering and its causes. I myself will cause them to be free from suffering and its causes. Please, Guru Deity, bless me to be able to do this. How wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were never separated from the happiness of higher rebirth and liberation. May they never be separated from this. I myself will cause them never to be separated from this. Please, Guru Deity, bless me to be able to do this. And finally, we think of, as we're going to invite Lama Tsongkhapa and his two main disciples to be present with us for the duration of our practice, we can think of creating this purified place around us. Everywhere, may the ground be pure, free of pebbles and so forth, as level as the palms of the hand, in the nature of sapphire and soft. And when we start the actual practice of Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga, we can first of all visualize that we're inviting Lama Tsongkhapa and his two chief disciples to reside in the space in front of us. On the heart of the sever of the 100 deities of the Shiva, on the peak of God resembling a clump of extremely white fresh curd, King of Dhamma, Nisan Lawson Drapa, please come here together with your sons. And as we invited Lama Tsongkhapa and his two chief disciples, we think, in the sky before me on lying throne, lotus and moon, my perfect pure Guru smiles with delight. Supreme field of merit from a mind of faith, please abide for 100 eons to spread the teaching. So if you visualize Lama Tsongkhapa in the space in front of you, you can also think that we are receiving teachings, the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa, and also the teachings of the Buddha and the great Nalanda masters from our own spiritual teachers, Lama Tsongkhapa and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and different geshes in the FMT centers, and also other teachers that you might be relying upon. So you can think that Lama Tsongkhapa in the space in front of you embodies all those teachers, the same entity, the same nature of all those teachers. And then we start with the practice of the 7 limbs of worship in order to accumulate the collections and purify negativities and obscurations. So we offer prostrations, we confess all negative actions done before, we rejoice in the virtues of those teachers. I don't remember if I mentioned making offerings. We also ask them to still remain with us. We ask them to continue to turn the wheel of Dhamma, and we dedicate all the virtue that we create through this practice. And so we begin with prostrations. Your holy mind is the intelligence that understands the full extent of objects to be known. Your holy speech, with its excellent explanation, is an ear ornament for those of good fortune. Your holy body is radiantly beautiful with glory renown. To you are meaningful to see, hear, and remember are prostrate. Then we make offerings to Lama Tsongkhapa, and also we can think that we're making it to all of our teachers, His Holiness is Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, the geshes in the FMT organization, and other teachers as well. Pleasant drinking water, various flowers, fragrant incenses, light-scented waters, and so forth. Oceans of cloud-like offerings, both actually arranged and mentally emanated, I offer to you the supreme field of merit. Confessing all negative actions done by yourself, rejoicing in the creation of which, and also those that we made other people do. So whatever non-virtual body, speech, and mind, especially those opposite to the three vows that are collected from beginning to time, I confess each and every one with fervent regret from my heart. We also rejoice in the extensive deeds of Lama Tsongkhapa and his spiritual children. They strive for much learning and practice in this degenerate age and make freedoms and riches meaningful by abandoning the egg-worthy concerns. Seven, we sincerely rejoice in your extensive deeds. And we request the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa to still remain with us through the activities of Lama Tsongkhapa. Perfect pure holy gurus in the billion clouds of wisdom and compassion is staffed with Dhammakaya. Please let follow rain of profound extensive Dhamma upon the receptacle of those to be subdued exactly as they need. And finally, we dedicate the virtue. May whatever virtue I've collected benefit the teachings and all transmigratory beings. And in particular, may it cause the essence of perfect pure Losam Draka's teachings to shine forever. Losam Draka, by the way, is Lama Tsongkhapa's name. And so as we made those requests to Lama Tsongkhapa to still remain with us for the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa to remain with us, it is common to make mandala offerings as a token for requesting that. This crown anointed with perfume, strong with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, for continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this is a Buddha land and offering. May all transmigratory beings enjoy this pure land. But the merits of having offered this mandala to Lama Tsongkhapa and his two sons, may I, my family members, and all sentient beings be able to meet, practice, and actualize the teachings of the victorious one, Losam Draka. Where the morality of an eminently pure way of life was courageous in the extensive conduct of the sons of the victorious one, and accomplished the yoga of the two stages of supreme bliss and emptiness. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kanai Kanyakayami. And so as we visualize Lama Tsongkhapa and his two spiritual children in front of us, we can think of purifying rays of light and purifying nectar coming down from the heart of Lama Tsongkhapa, entering into a crown and eliminating all obscurations and negativities, making a mind completely pure, be ready to accomplish the great qualities of Lama Tsongkhapa, to embody love, compassion, wisdom, and ability. And so we think that by the force of having fervently requested in this way, hollow beams of white light are emitted from the hearts of the perfect pure father and sons, and combining into one enter my crown. White nectar, the color of milk, flows from the opening of pure white light, cleansing all my sicknesses, fear, harms, negative karmas, obscurations, and the imprints without exception. My body becomes as pure and clear as crystal. And so we will now recite 3 times the 5-line Mixima verse, the one that I referred to, the verse of the Guru Yoga of Lama Tsongkhapa, thinking of Lama Tsongkhapa as being the embodiment of Chenrezig and Jushri and Vajrapani, embodying the quality of compassion, wisdom, and ability. And so we're seeking inspiration from Lama Tsongkhapa to become exactly like him. So we'll recite it 3 times in Tibetan. Jime Kembe Wampo Japan, Dupo Malu Jones Sanweta, Kanche Kebe Tsubian Tsongkhapa, Losanda Peshala Sowade, Mimete Wete Chenchenrezi, Jime Kembe Wampo Jampian, Dupo Malu Jones Sanweta, Kanche Kebe Tsubian Tsongkhapa, Losanda Peshala Sowade, Mimete Wete Chenchenrezi, Jime Kembe Wampo Jampian, Dupo Malu Jones Sanweta, Kanche Kebe Tsubian Tsongkhapa, Losandra Peshala Sowade. And in English, Avalokiteshvara, great treasure of non-objectifying compassion. Manjushri, master of stainless wisdom, Lord of secrets, destroyer of the entire host of Maras. Tsongkhapa, crown ornament of the sages of the land of snow. Losandrapa, at your feet I met requests. And so, to finish off with our recitation, let's recite together the foundation of all good qualities, which is a succinct presentation of the states of the path to enlightenment by Lama Tsongkhapa. And as we recite that, we can think that we're receiving the blessings of Lama Tsongkhapa, inspiration from Lama Tsongkhapa to progress along the steps of the path, to develop our mind to a perfect state, for our mind to become Buddha. The foundation of all good qualities is the kind and perfect pure Guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. Understanding that the precious freedom of this river is found only once, is greatly meaningful and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly day and night takes its essence. This life is impermanent as a water bubble. Remember how quickly decays and death comes. After death, just like a shadow follows the body, the result of black and white karma follows. Finding firm and definite conviction in this, please bless me to always be careful to abandon even the slightest negative action and accomplish all virtuous deeds. Seeking samsaric pleasure is the door to all sufferings. They are uncertain and cannot be relied upon. Recognizing these shortcomings, please bless me to generate a strong wish for the bliss of liberation. Led by this pure thought, mindfulness, alertness, and great caution arise. The root of the teachings is given the Praktimoksha path. Please bless me to accomplish this essential practice. Just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, serve all-minded transmigratory beings. Please bless me to see this, train the Supreme Bodhisattva, and bear the responsibility of freeing transmigratory beings. Even if I develop only for the chief path, but I do not practice the three types of morality, I will not achieve enlightenment. With my clear recognition of this, please bless me to practice the Bodhisattva vows with great energy. Once I have pacified distraction to wrong objects and correctly analyzed the meaning of reality, please bless me to generate quickly within my mind stream the unified path of calm abiding, especially inside. Having become a pure vessel by training in the general path, please bless me to enter the holy gateways of the fortunate ones, the supreme batch of equals. At that time, the basis of accomplishing the two attainments is giving pure vows in Samaya. As I've become firmly convinced in this, please bless me to protect these vows and pledges like my life. Then, having realized the importance of the two stages is the essence of the Vajrayana. By practicing with great energy, never giving up before sessions, please bless me to realize the teachings of the Holy Guru. Like that, when the Guru who showed the noble path and the spiritual friends of practicing have long lives, please bless me to pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. In all my lives, never separated from perfect Gurus, may I enjoy the magnificent Dharma. By completing the qualities of the stages and path, may I quickly attain the state of Vajradhara. Or we completed this practice by thinking that Lama Tsongkhapa is entering our mind and our heart, becoming indivisible with our mind and forever inspiring ourselves, our mind, to become Buddha. Magnificent and precious root Guru, please abide on the lotus seat at my heart, guide me with great kindness, and grant me the realization of your holy Buddha speech and mind. Magnificent and precious root Guru, please abide in the lotus seat at my heart, guide me with your great kindness, and grant me the supreme and common realizations. Magnificent and precious root Guru, please abide in the lotus seat at my heart, guide me with your great kindness, and remain steadfast until I attain the essence of enlightenment. We finish off with dedications, but it falls off the victorious one, Tsongkhapa, acting as our direct Mahayana virtues friend in all our lives. May we never turn away for even a second from the pure path highly admired by the victorious ones. May we be able to live a life of pure morality, listen to many teachings, train in bodhicitta, and have pure view and conduct, without corrupting or polluting the teachings of Tsongkhapa, the second victorious one. Glorious Gurus, whatever your body, retinue, lifespan, and realm, whatever your supreme and excellent name, may I and others become exactly like that. But if also the presence and requests made to you, may all diseases, evil spirits, poverty, and quarrels be calm. And may the Dhamma and good fortune increase in the regions in which I and others dwell. This blesses that the lives of the glorious Gurus belong, that all beings equal in due sense of safety happy, that I and others without exception collect merits and purify obscurations, and that we quickly achieve Buddhahood. May I not give rise to heresies for even a second in regard to the actions of the glorious Guru. May I see whatever actions are done as pure. With this devotion, may I receive the Guru's blessings in my heart. For the Dhamma King Tsongkhapa, way of Dhamma to flourish, may all signs of obstacles be pacified and all conducive conditions be completed. Due to the two types of merits of the three types of myself and others, May the teachings of the victorious one, Lord Tsongkhapa, shine resplendent forever. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day. If you're here during the evening, we have group which at 6:30. And what do we have before that?
4 o'clock if you want to come and talk to that.
Yeah. So we will set up at 4 afternoon with light offering water. So if you're here and you want to join us, please come along. Thank you. Hey Nitya, how are you recovering?
I'm really good. How are you?
All right, still coughing like a chain smoker, but I'm good.
Yeah, you sound a little better. I hope you get better and better sooner rather than later. Thank you so much for the teaching. Fantastic. Yeah, sorry I can't be up there in person, but hey.
No worries.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a nice day. Bye bye.